Okay.
It was really hard to figure out what I wanted to share with this group because I just have all of this stuff in my head from almost 40 years and I've worked in organizations where I was the absolutely only woman. They didn't even have ladies' restrooms. And I've worked in environments where I had all women working for me and mixes of, but you know, it's really interesting because there's so much to share. So I thought, okay, girl, you're going to have to narrow down. You're not going to have a lot of time. So what I said was, well, how can I pick what to talk about? And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'm going to pick the subjects that I've had to talk about the most when I'm mentoring or coaching women and men, either as leaders or women in the workplace trying to work with men, you know, that kind of thing. So I tried to narrow it down just to give you some tips of some of the things I've talked about. So I'm just going to go down the list. So I have the list here. The first one was men and women, territory versus collaboration. A lot of women think they're having trouble communicating with their people that work with them because they get upset. And what I've found is women want to get everybody together and work together. They want to work collaboratively. Now, if they're leading a group of men want to know what their position is and what they're going to be responsible for, and they'll take care of what they're responsible for. Women take that to be a communication breakdown, and men take it as, doesn't she understand this is my territory? And if you understand that you're looking at the workplace differently, where men say, tell me where the line is for my things, and I'll do that. You know, here's the 5 people that report to me. Here's the, you know, where a woman wants to work more cooperatively. Well, if you notice that this supervisor, this person over here is having trouble, would you step in and help them? Oh, that's not my group. I'm not responsible for that group. So this whole territory versus collaboration is huge when you're working with men and women. So watch for that. I call it serial versus intuitive thinkers. She's using relational and individualistic people. Well, I call it serial and intuitive thinkers because what I see is there's a group of people who have a brain that tends to work systematically in a series, step to step, and then there's the brains that jump and can jump all over the place and connect dots, you know, that aren't necessarily seemingly to connect.
And what do you call this again?
Serial versus intuitive thinkers.
Serial, but not like
serial as in doing something in a series.
Okay.
Yeah, not like Oreo, not like Cheerios. Yeah. But I call it serial versus intuitive thinking. Typically, I have to use this lecture the most with women engineers who work with men engineers, and then women leaders who lead men engineers, because the woman just doesn't understand why they don't see what she sees. This whole thing over here, what I can see that you don't know, you know. So what I tell them is this: when you're in meetings with men, understand that they think serially. You can't just say, here's the problem, and say, oh, the solution is right here. This bottle of water is going to solve that problem. You cannot do that with serial thinkers. And it's not just men and women, not just men versus women. There are women who think serially, and there are men. Most men think serially. You get this whole demographic thing. For me, it's more like 80-20. You know, if you're an intuitive thinker, if solutions are obvious to you, if you're the kind of person who can connect the dots that don't seem connectable, you have to learn the skills of explaining your answer in a series of steps that those serial thinkers can follow. So if you're in a meeting with a bunch of serial thinkers and they say, okay, this problem, and you say, well, in your head you're saying, don't ever blurt it out. You say, oh, the answer's A. Then think about, how can you get them to A? How can you get them to move from where they are to A? And so in the meeting, you'll start interjecting information. Well, if we move from here to here, you know, do you think that would be good? Yeah, that's good, that's good. Okay, now what if we move from here to here? Well, that would really be good. Well, what happens if we go from here to the one? Oh, that's great. That's the solution we were looking for. If you learn to do that as an intuitive person, you will be be very successful with the engineers. What you've done is you've learned to communicate with a serial thinker. If a person is a serial thinker and they have a boss who's intuitive, then you have to do the opposite. You're going in to give your boss an idea of what you want to do. You as a serial thinker have done this, and then this, and then this, and then this. Your view foils are lots and lots of words typed and crammed in as many as you can with still being able to see it. Pages and pages and pages. I call those white paper view foils. You know, somebody's really writing a white paper, they're not really writing a view foil. Okay? If you go into a boss that's intuitive, what you do is you change your pitch around and you start with the conclusion. And you say, here's the problem, this is where I think we should go. How much of the details do you want to go over? Some intuitive leaders will say, oh, I can connect those two dots. I don't have any problem. We're done. Other ones will say, well, I need to understand it a little bit more. Then you take that intuitive boss and you start walking them through the series of information until they get far enough along that they connect the dot. It's a whole different, and if you understand that these people have these different ways their brains work, and then you change your presentation so that you can help them to understand it. So, you know, look at the people around you, look at your bosses, look at your peers, and understand, are they a serial thinker or are they an intuitive thinker? The other is if you're a woman and you're in a meeting, because you have lots of connections in your brain that men don't have, your brain works faster. Physically faster. Okay? Never, ever respond in the first 10 seconds. Okay? Because how men who don't have those synapses will say, you didn't really think about what you were going to say. You just blurted out the first thing that came into your head. That's how they'll interpret it. So what I coach women leaders and women engineers who are in meetings is, stop yourself. Wait until somebody else in the room says something first, and then you can say something. Because if you do that, you don't get seen as the person that's just jumping off the cliff and throwing out these harebrained ideas and harebrained schemes. So the other is, wait before you talk. And I know that doesn't sound funny.
No,
Okay.
I'm laughing because this is brilliant. This is brilliant. You are
It's very true.
This is so true.
Okay. Collaborative versus competitive. You need to understand if the people you're working with, which ones of them have been culturized as competitive and which ones have been culturized as collaborative, so that you can find the roles in your organizations to fit those people. So basically what happens is I had 10 senior managers, I had 450 people, I had 10 senior managers who all had first level managers reporting to them, who had group leaders reporting to them. So there's lots of hierarchy and stuff. But I'd understood the personality of each of those individual people who, some were women, some were men, they were of different cultures, a real mix. But if there was a job assignment that needed to be done that needed collaboration, I would pick the leader that was a collaborator. If there was something that needed to be done quickly, like we were going to compete on something with the other facility on the East Coast, I would pick a competitive person. So by understanding who they are and how they're culturized and how they think, you can actually use their skills to do the best that you can. You can also match leaders to your groups and what the groups need. If you have a group of people who need a relational person, then you put a relational person there. If you have a group of people who need the individualistic thinker, then you can put an individualistic thinker there. But like I had this one manager, Jim, who was very relational, and he was an engineer. So he fit into engineering like a sore thumb. But he was very good, he was a very good leader. And one day I went to him and said, Jim, I'd like you to go compete for the job in the calibration lab of senior manager. Calibration lab? Why would I go to the calibration lab? I said, because those guys over there that are there today are relational. And they need somebody who sees them as people and wants to talk to them as people and care about them as people and nurture them and help them grow and develop. Okay? So he got the job. A marriage made in heaven. Okay? And it was mostly men there, but they were not individualistic men. and they needed nurturing, and they needed someone who was going to listen to them and see them as people. So you can look at those different styles and match your leaders to those styles. Some other interesting things is stamina versus strength. Okay. Men are strong physically. Women tend to have stamina. That's how our bodies were made in order to do the things that we do in the whole role of survival as human beings. But here's how it plays a role for you if you're managing men and women. Okay, women, as you're going through the day, you can keep saying, well, now let's go do this, and now let's go do this, and now let's go do this. And then you can follow along and go and go and go and go. Men, on the other hand, have a certain amount of energy every day. Okay? And they take that energy in their head, and they don't necessarily know they're even doing it, and they say, I have this much energy. I can spend this much energy doing this much energy doing that, and this much energy doing that. And that's why when they come home and you say, but honey, I need you to go put that new door up. And they're tired. Well, I didn't allocate any energy for that. If I'd have known you wanted me to put the door up, they know in their own mind they wouldn't have done these two things at work today.
So funny. This is so true.
Okay? They wouldn't do these two things at work because then they'd have the energy to put the door up. So don't just spray a door on them. Okay? They have to figure out for the day how they're going to allocate their energy. Where women, if you say at the end of the day, oh, let's go shopping. Well, yeah, I'll jump in the car and we go shopping. I mean, it's because you have a difference between the strength and energy allocation versus the stamina. Does that make sense? So that's another thing you'll see. So if you've got a group of men that you've got to work, you make sure you know exactly what you want them to do all day long. Don't get to the end and say, oh, I forgot, we need to do this too. Because what you're going to see is all these men going, oh, I wish we'd have known that this morning. I wish you'd have told me this morning. Okay, now there are some women who have that same issue where they have a certain amount of energy and they allocate it. And then there are, are men who have stamina. But for the most part, it tends to fall into that category. So, the next one is what versus why. When you have a group of men and women, the tendency is when you say, okay, guys, I need this bottle of water moved to the end of the table by the end of the day. They say, we'll get it done, boss. The women say, well, why do you need to do that? Okay? It's because women need the why and the men need the what. So if you aren't prepared, if you have women working for you to tell the why, okay, and if you aren't prepared to say, I'm not going to take that as questioning my authority, okay, they're not questioning your authority, they just simply want to know why. Okay, and if you say to them, well, tomorrow morning, in the first thing, there's going to be a person at the end of the table that's going to be really, really thirsty because they've been jogging, all morning, and they're going to be thirsty before they speak, so they're going to need a bottle of water. The woman will say, right on, we'll get it down there. Okay, so understand that the two different groups need different things. And some need the what, and some need the why. You have, the next one is fitting the mold versus changing the mold. You talk about how you want to get promoted to a certain position, and everybody says, well, you got to fit the mold, which means I need to compromise who I am, completely fake what I'm like, completely use different skill sets that I'm not comfortable with. Now I fit the mold, now they're going to put me in the job. That's how people hear it who don't fit that mold. What I have found to be more successful is that over time you have to try to affect the perception of that job. And over time say, gee, what if the mold was changed just a little bit right here? Do you think that kind of person could do that job? Oh, yeah, I think that person could do that job. Well, what if you think this got changed in the mold? Do you think that person could do that job? And if you work on the mold, like you're trying to get your leaders to start interviewing women or promoting women, okay, you have to work on them to start seeing the mold as being flexible enough to accept the women, or to accept the Asians, or to accept the Hispanics. Okay? You have to be able to have them be able to visualize, because if the people in power cannot visualize you sitting in this chair, you will never ever be qualified to be in that chair. have to have a perception of who sits in this chair that fits enough and is flexible enough that you can sit in it. And believe me, once your leadership team can see you sitting in that chair, it happens very quickly. And I'll give you a story, which is kind of funny. I wanted to be the resident director of the Strategic Weapons Facility Pacific. Okay? Not only were there no women managers there certainly weren't any women directors at military facilities running the facility. So that is not exactly the mold. Okay? But I knew that the 5 vice presidents in Sunnyvale were the ones that would be on the committee to decide, who should be in that job. And so I knew the job was going to get vacant in a year, that the person was going to be retiring. They weren't necessarily thinking about that because they were worried about fighting the fires and getting things done. But what I did was, I got on their calendar with each of them, one at a time, brought in my resume and my experience, and I sat down with them, and I did 2 things. I used their bias against them, and I educated them in the mold. And I said, here's all my experience, here's all the things I know how to do, here's all the organizations I've led. I know how to build every single part that goes on the missile. I've rotated to every manufacturing, every quality assurance, all of these organizations. This whole, I've done 25 jobs. This was going to be my 26th. Okay? So they'd say, oh, I had no idea you had that background. The second thing I did is I'd say, you know what? In 10 years, all of you guys are going to be gone. In fact, they're all gone. They either died or retired. I said, and I'll be one of the few people left to make good decisions for the Fleet Ballistic Missile Program. So I believe I need to keep moving and getting more experience. I would like your advice. Should I come into your organization? Or what do you think about the job up at SwiftPac that's going to open up in a year?
So great.
Okay. What they said was, I think that job at SwiftPac would be perfect for you. Okay? I did that exactly 5 times.
Oh my God.
Okay? I did 2 things. I educated them in the mold, made sure they understood all my experience and all my successes, but I also used their biases against them. And I did that 5 times, and all 5 of them, to my total amazement, said, Carol, we think you need to be that resident director at SwiftPac. Okay? Now, I was good friends with the HR organization, so they called all these vice presidents together to do the selection because the director up there retired. And here's their 3 candidates, and they went through the candidates, and the HR person said she'd never seen a selection happen so quickly, ever.
Wow.
And 100%, everybody said, oh, Carol needs to go there. So I did 2 things. Change the perception of the mold, okay, but also use their biases. So anyway, but think about, does the mold need to be changed in order for your leadership and your management to see you in that job? And if it does, then you have to start affecting that. Otherwise, they'll just never see you in that job. And to them, it's the whole, they aren't ready. They aren't, they don't have, they don't look like who should look like in this chair. Okay? So unless you change that perception, it is never going to happen. Emotion plays no matter what. If you have relational people, if you have women, if you have intuitive people, you are going to have emotional people in your workplace. If you have emotional people in your workplace, you must consider, whenever you're making major decisions, what is the emotional impact on the organization? Okay? And that tends to be one of the things that leaders don't do at all. They don't think about, well, if I make this decision A, what could be the emotional response? Okay, and let me give you an example. We were starting to fall behind schedule to try to get the missiles built. If we got too far behind schedule, the submarine would come in and we wouldn't have a missile to put in it. That exactly is not a good thing for our country. So it's kind of a pretty high priority thing. So I brought my management team together and said, we're starting to fall behind. We're working overtime, but we're not catching up. So my engineering leader says, we need to stop working this 980 shift and put everybody back on 5 days a week. Then we'll catch up better. Because we're really in on Fridays because of this whole people getting to do 980s. Well, people love the 980s, including me. Getting every other Friday off was fabulous, especially for the people who worked in the shops who had to work on the missiles and get them done. Because if they got behind, they could work Friday and still have Saturday and Sunday off. Because they were the younger workforce, they actually valued their families and valued being at home. What a thought. But, so the knee jerk then around the room was, yeah, let's get rid of the 980s. And I said, okay, let's think about the emotional impact that's going to happen when you do that. Okay? First of all, everybody's going to be upset. Everybody's going to be resentful. Do you think that's going to slow things down at all? Do you think everybody milling around and being unhappy and, doing this is really going to be a good thing? Yeah, you're kind of right about that. I said, so let's do this. Let's make the threat of that be more effective than actually doing it. Okay? So, think about the emotional impact. So, the decision was then, instead of doing it, okay, and getting the emotional repercussions, we wouldn't do it, but we'd threaten to do it, and we'd get those emotional reactions. So, the emotional reactions for we're going to threaten to do it, but not do it, was everybody said, oh, we don't want to lose our Fridays off. We better catch up. In 6 weeks, they were caught up. We never had to invoke the taking the 980 away. That was the whole idea of the better decision was the one that had the better emotional response. So think about the emotional responses when you think about your decisions. It's kind of funny, you know.
You're brilliant.
Social versus networking. It's really interesting when you talk to people who are E's versus I's, the Myers-Briggs extroverts versus introverts. If you have a social gathering or you have, let's say you're going to have a dinner, okay? The I's will see it as social. The E's will see it as networking. Okay? So you have to start understanding how can you get networking with the I's. Okay? In that particular case, if you want to get networking going on with the I's, you have to find ways to bring people together so that they can network and get bound together tighter. Okay? And ways that works is having small groups, like there's 4 of you that go to lunch, and you do all the talking and lunch. The other is, if you have 2 managers that just absolutely are not working well together, send them on a trip together. Send them on a class together, send them to a facility to go, go to meetings. Okay? Because what happens is, they tend to go out to eat. Some of them go play golf, whatever. Some of them go fish, whatever. But they go on, if nothing else, all they do is at least eat with each other because they don't know anybody at that facility or they don't know anybody at that training. They just know each other. When they come back, you will find a huge difference in their ability to work together. And all they did was spend some time together and eat dinner together. But what happens is it builds those emotional bonds that introverts tend not to do. So that's my other tip. So that was quick, but I just wanted to get those points in. And if you want to do Q&A, I know we have a lot of things to cover in your class.
By all means, questions.